Another thing that Nietzsche says is that Socrates created the most unfortunate union in the history of the West, the union of reason, virtue, and happiness. And Callicles in this dialogue is fighting against reason, virtue, and happiness. Socrates calls this the most bizarre equation which goes against all the earlier instincts of the Greeks.
Wait, Socrates calls it that, or Nietzsche calls it?
Nietzsche.
Okay.
So, before Socrates, the Greeks are dominated by Dionysus and Apollos, war and lust. And Socrates really refutes that and says the new standard of life is reason, virtue, and happiness. Nietzsche wants, with his dynamite, being the dynamite man that he is, he wants to blow up that shrine and build a new one. Okay? Nietzsche calls Socrates the biggest perversity in the history of values. He invented the most tedious and dangerous of all errors, a nightmare. So Socrates created a nightmare from which Europe has just awakened.
It costs all these good dreams, though.
For Nietzsche also, he sees Socrates and Plato as being Christians before Christ. So Nietzsche sets out to defend the sophists against Socrates. And the reason Nietzsche loves the sophists, people like Callicles, because the sophists, this is a quote, they had the courage to recognize and defend their own immorality. So Callicles is the spokesman of the sophists. He's of the same kind as the way Athens is described in Thucydides and also Machiavelli. Callicles represents the Athenians in the Melian dialogue. The Melian dialogue is the famous dialogue in Thucydides where there's this little island that's really a nothing island, and they try to become neutral in the Peloponnesian War. And Athens gives them the choice. You either become our slaves or we will destroy you. There's no neutrality in this war. And Melos tries to argue against Athens to remain free. And Athens basically in the end just wipes them out, destroys everyone on the island. And that's one of the famous dialogues of the Peloponnesian War. How Athens asserts that what is right or what is true is what we say is right or true because we have the power to back it up. So Nietzsche sees himself as being on the same side as Callicles, as Athens during the Melian dialogue, and also as promoting the kind of situation that existed on an island called Corcyra during the Peloponnesian War. That's the island where Thucydides describes the brutality that takes place between the oligarchs and the democrats during a bloody civil war on Corcyra.
How's that spelled? How's that island?
Corcyra. It's in Book 3, Chapter 82 of the Peloponnesian War, if anybody wants to. I was going to look it up and quote it, but I didn't have time, so I'm very sorry. Once again, I let you down.
I'm really falling behind.
What Nietzsche likes about Callicles is his speech that begins part of it's at 483E to 484A, where he describes himself as a lion that society cannot tame. Nietzsche says basically to tame a lion is to make it sick. Civilization is a form of taming lions. Man is a beast. And taming or civilizing the beast involves too much chains and too much torture. So we need to create society in which the lion can become the new form of humanity. The lion represents the new form of humanity that is to come in the future. And Nietzsche and his philosophy are meant to free the lion from the chains of civilization. The nature of the lion at 483b is instinct. Law or civilization is a contract between weak people. Society, civilization is for weak people. Society is for slaves. Law is the morality for slaves. Those who preach reason, virtue, self-control, and justice are people who lack manhood. Virtue is just another form of tyranny. The only true virtue is strength. By the way, the first word of the dialogue in Greek is fighting, polemo. And normally, the word would not be the first word of a Greek sentence, so it's out of order of what a normal Greek sentence would be. So Plato wants to emphasize that this dialogue is about fighting, whether fighting is the basis of society. This movie, The Fight Club, would be a return to Callicles. We want to return things to Callicles. The language of the Gorgias, when Gorgias himself is speaking, he oftentimes will use the Greek word logos. So the language of the Gorgias is one of logos. The language of Gorgias, the rhetorician, or the language of Gorgias, the teacher, is one of logos. I will argue, though, just as Nietzsche said, logos is a mask. For Gorgias, reason is a mask. When Paulus speaks, there are several times, important times, during Paulus's dialogues when he uses the word thumos. And when Callicles speaks, he's always using the word for feelings or passions, epithumai. So what we see in the dialogue is how logos is a mask for thumos, and thumos is a mask for passions. So Gorgias, who begins the dialogue pretending to remain neutral, or pretending to appeal to logos, or appealing to a kind of neutrality, well, when his mask is taken off, and when the mask of Paulus is taken off, what we're shown is Callicles, right? That the real purpose of life is to pursue pleasure, to gain power for oneself so that someone can pursue pleasure. And I think we could argue, and I know I've said this before in several classes, so this might be repetition by which I'm putting you to sleep, but we could argue that the history of the West, especially since the French Revolution, has followed this progression. In the United States right now, there was a time in the history of the United States where I think different people would argue at different times this became the case. But certainly by the early 20th century in the United States, the desire for wealth or money making starts to take precedence. And then at some point among intellectuals in the U.S., among the cultural elite, by the 1920s, pleasure seeking or the kind of Nietzschean philosophy starts to take hold. And we see the rest of the 20th century as kind of a struggle between those who want to build an economic empire, those who want to build a society of pure democracy, democracy being equal access to all the passions, and then those who want to make an empire out of the United States. Thank you. You're going to leave this like that the whole time?
Sure.
Very good. So the whole movement of the dialogue is to show how in the soul that is disordered, or in the Phaedo we'll see Socrates use very strong language. about how the life of philosophy is to free us from slavery to the passions. But the Callicles or the Gorgias, can you pour me some water too?
Sure.
And try to keep the ice out of it if you can. And the Callicles
Could you pass
and
me
the Gorgias,
There must be people that when you're like waiting on them and they're like, oh, can I have a cup of Coke? I'm free to decide.
yeah. Well, I just prefer no ice. So I usually try
What
to.
you're doing there.
I like two.
It's taking forever.
I like 2 cubes in there. Is that okay?
That's fine. I'm not going to complain. It's just I'm not going to fire you or give you a B if you don't pour the right amount.
I'm not a shark, right?
The right amount. But I'm just anyway. Sorry. So the whole flow of the dialogue is how the lower part takes over the higher part of the soul. And a big teaching, I think, for Socrates is sincerity. Sincerity is when the person, if I were just to say it off the top of my head, I would say, when we look at the person, we have the heart. The heart would be the deepest desires or the deepest dispositions of the person. We have the thoughts, what might go through your head on any given day. We have your words, the things that you say. And then we also have your deeds, what you do. Basic human coherence requires that the person over time develops a kind of consistency between all of those things. Someone who is sincere, someone who has the virtue of sincerity, has consistency between their heart, their thoughts, their words, and their deeds. I would say with an added feature that they are also struggling to always discover and live by the truth. Because someone could say, well, I'm sincere, I'm just a jerk. So all my thoughts are jerk-like thoughts. My heart is the heart of a jerk. My words are jerk-like words. And everything I do, I treat other people like a jerk. I'm sincere. Well, no, I would say not exactly. It's true that you might be that way, but do you see where your behavior stands with respect to the good? And do you have the dispositions to try to conform yourself to the good and the true? So that would be the difference between just basic human consistency and sincerity. Ultimately, in the life of a human person, one way of describing this might be too simplistic, but what the heck? Either you change your behavior to conform to the ideals that you're learning, or you will change your ideas to conform with your behavior. And this is one of the great things I personally think about universities or college. College is the time, we all have ideals. College is the time when you can really discover your ideals and you can start to learn what it means to discover the true and the good. And it's where you can start to struggle to make your moral behavior conform to your ideals. The tragedy of college would be that someone never starts to discover their ideals and they become trapped in their behavior. And so over time, without even realizing it, their ideals conform to less than salutary behavior. This is something, I know we've gone over this before, but did we go over Wilhelm Reich before? Wilhelm Reich is a follower of Nietzsche in the 20th century. Freud was a big follower of Nietzsche. Freud's whole thing of the ego, the superego, and the id, he basically follows the form of the soul of Socrates, but he flips it upside down. And the goal of the unconscious is to uncover your unconscious desires and to free them, really, from any form of guilt that comes from reason and virtue, or anything that might teach you reason and virtue. Wilhelm Reich was a student of Nietzsche and of Freud, and he discovered that the best way to undo Socratic institutions is not through one-on-one psychology sessions, but was through mass behavior, stadiums, group therapy sessions, seminars. And the way to do this in particular was to have seminars where people would speak or act out in the seminars things that were immoral. And what he discovered is that if we can get people to do immoral things by experience, to accept immoral things, or if we can get people to start to think that feelings are the standard for judging behavior, over time, they'll just stop arguing about whether God exists or whether virtue is possible. Those concerns will no longer be concerns. So it's kind of interesting. I was reading an article last year by a philosopher, and this guy was quoted as saying, in 1968, we all just mysteriously lost interest in Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle and Aquinas. In 1968, we all just magically lost interest in all these philosophers, right? Their principles stopped guiding us. Well, why would that be? I think it would be, how would I explain that culturally? Culturally, I would explain that by the fact that by the late 1960s and early 1970s, we have about 10 years or so of behavior, especially among the cultural elite, maybe more than that, but certainly it's widespread enough by the late 60s. We have behavior such that there's no point in thinking about God anymore. I look at my own family and I can kind of see this. I have 4 uncles who all lost their faith in the 60s. And when I ask them why or how they can defend their position, they can never come up with reasons why. They can never argue why that is. They can only say, what I learned as a kid just doesn't make sense anymore. And as I become a little bit more older and I start to learn about what they did in the 60s, I think I start to understand that, well, it's a lot of, if someone gets into a lot of alcohol, drugs, LSD, heroin, sexual experimentation of all kinds, this person is going to start over time to lose whatever they thought they believed in outside of their sensory experiences. Socrates recognized this. Speaking of sensory experiences.
Yeah. That's right.
These potato chips will make us all become Reichians.
I'm gonna have to do.
I don't care. I lost interest.
So I can get easy access. It's not my problem.
The name Callicles, by the way, it means, kalos means beauty, and then if you add an ikles onto it, it means he who appears to be beautiful. But appearances is important. Appearances here is in the sense of appearances from the Little Prince. This is what I like about the fact you've all had a class with me before. There's all these things I can refer to, and you know what I'm talking about.
Yep.
You should at least.
I had my dad read that book, and he didn't think it was very meaningful.
When I told my mom I was reading it, she's like, I
Serious.
cannot believe you bought that at the bookstore. I think I have it at home.
Oh,
She's like, I think Taylor's read it. My little sister.
for her class in high school.
No, for her second grade book report.
Oh,
He's my ex-girlfriend.
Yeah.
yeah, that's what everybody says to me. One of my favorite moments in life as a teacher was when one of my students came to me and said, Professor Langen, thanks to you and your class, I broke up with my boyfriend.
Yeah.
Not that I'm against love. No, but I know it's
Must have been real jerk.
no, but actually what she said was that she said I realized. She said, I realized that I would go to my boyfriend and I would talk about all the things we were learning in your class. And I realized after 3 months that my boyfriend and I just didn't share the same values. So that's important. When you're looking for someone to marry, you should find someone who shares your values. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard.
And has a will strong enough to follow through with it.
Well, yeah, that's another thing.
Oops.
Notice that one of the first things that Callicles says in the dialogue is basically, here's how you're going to do your part in war or battle. Life is a physical war or battle against other groups and people. Notice that Pallas, his first answer to Chaerephon, is what does it matter what my answers are as long as they're good enough for you? Right, the purpose of speech or dialogue is not to discover the truth for Pallas. The purpose is to beat the other guy. It's to satisfy the other guy so he doesn't talk anymore. One of the first times Gorgias speaks, at 449d, he uses the words in Greek, peri logos, P-E-R-I, and then logos. And this means he's concerned with the things of reason, but he's just concerned with it. He's not really interested in it. Gorgias is the one who first tries to define oratory. Right? Oratory as being the craft by which we influence other people through speeches. Socrates says, well, what's it about? Is it about what people talk about at drinking parties? Health, good looks, and wealth? Oh, that reminds me. There's a passage from the Protagoras we cannot forget. It's the passage where Socrates wants to stop interpreting poetry. And they say to him, Socrates, well, why shouldn't we? What's so wrong about interpreting poetry all the time? And Socrates says, look, interpreting poetry is like going to a second-rate drinking party where you have to have music in the background all the time so nobody can really talk to one another. So it's almost like he's basically saying being an English major is like going to a PLS major is like going to a second-rate drinking party. Right? It's like going to...
PLS major.
Who is? Oh, he is, huh? Well, now you can tell him it's like being a PLS major is like going to a second-rate drinking party. Where all you're interested in is having the right music in the background so that nobody can really have a real conversation.
I underlined that. That's heavy poetry.
You've been to a PLS party?
You've been to a PLS class?
I got invited to give a lecture one time before PLS, and I will never be invited again.
That's awesome.
It's one of my several stories in life where I was silenced.
Do you have a copy of that speech?
No, but I could give you a summary of it.
Go ahead.
My RS last year was a PLS major.
Oh, really?
The whole year. Gave him some trouble for it.
I was asked to speak on Thucydides in a contemporary context. And actually, it relates to this dialogue, so I can talk about it. No, because this dialogue is defending the kind of crass Athenian view of practicing politics during the Peloponnesian War.
We went through those real quick.
So, when the Iraqi war broke out, I was in France, and I was asked to give a lecture that fall to PLS on Thucydides and contemporary politics. and I knew that I was being invited into a hornet's nest. But part of me didn't care. When I was in France that summer, I realized everybody in Europe was calling George Bush a cowboy. And they were also, a lot of people were comparing the Iraqi war to the Battle of Syracuse in the Peloponnesian War. The Battle of Syracuse in the Peloponnesian War is the battle in which Athens lost its entire army. I've kind of said a little bit about it to you already, haven't I? It basically sent its entire army. It used all of its wealth, and it sent its entire army to Syracuse, and it lost. So I was asked to speak, and somehow I was referred to speak at this thing by someone from the Peace Institute. So they asked someone from the Peace Institute to speak, and then this person told them, well, he couldn't do it, but they should talk to me. So when I showed up there, I realized that this thing was the typical academic session, which was supposed to be completely one-sided against one PLS professor, with me and a female philosopher, political scientist, and I think there were 3 of us on the panel. But the whole pretense of these things oftentimes is to set it up, to pretend that it's equal sides, conservatives versus liberals. But what it really is it's usually 3 or 4 liberals versus 1 conservative, and the one or two supposed conservatives are actually on the liberal side. So they're there to undermine the conservative argument. That's how these things are usually set up. So that's how this was set up. And I know that from the way they set it up, they thought that this one PLS professor would be the conservative, and then they thought this political science female would be the liberal, and since I was the reference from the Kroc Institute, I would be the other liberal. But they put they put her on the conservative side, right? Thinking that she would undermine his position. And that I would then come along as the liberal pacifist, and I would just come out and... So what happened is, we all did. Actually, none of us will be invited back. We all did. Because he spoke, the PLS professor spoke first, so he was supposed to be... This was the argument that everyone else was supposed to refute. So he basically defended George Bush, saying that if the war in Iraq were to fail, it would fail because of internal politics in the U.S. Then it went to the female professor. And she argued, again, she kind of gave a nuanced presentation where she basically said, if we're going to learn from anything from Thucydides, we have to learn about the dangers of democratic politics. How in Athens, there were demagogues, some who were perceived liberals and some who were conservatives. Both undermined the democracy. And then it got to me, and I said, well, actually, I was in Europe this summer. And when I was in Europe this summer, everybody was comparing, everyone in Europe was comparing. First of all, they were calling George Bush a cowboy. Everywhere I went, people were saying, Cowboy Bush, Cowboy Bush, Cowboy Bush. And the second thing they were doing is they were comparing the war in Iraq to the Battle of Syracuse. And let me just tell you what I thought. I mean, I thought in the end, if you think about Bush, whether you think what he's doing is prudent or not, he might be a cowboy. But a cowboy is not as bad as the Europeans make him out to be. If you remember the movie High Noon, in the movie High Noon, the cowboy is about to leave being a sheriff. And for the sake of the common good of the city and for the sake of justice, he gives up his simple life going off to the farm to basically go at noon and to wait for the bad guys that are going to arrive and to shoot them so that they don't ruin the city. So the cowboy carries within him a sense of justice. And he's willing to leave his nice life on the farm to commit himself to political life and to battle so as to see justice and the common good reestablished in the city. And then in high noon, the cowboy, after he defeats the bad guys, he goes home to his farm. He doesn't stay around. Yeah, he doesn't stay around and rule the city tyrannically. So if we're going to call Bush a cowboy, it's not necessarily a derogatory statement, right? Because he might be acting out of a sense of justice. He carries the sense of justice with him, and he's willing to put down political power and go back to his farm once he's defeated his enemies. So calling Bush a cowboy is not necessarily a bad thing. So that got a gasp out of all the professors. All the professors just went, oh. The students were like, they were listening. They were at least open. And then I said, and furthermore, Syracuse is a bad example. If the war in Iraq is the beginning of a long struggle against Islam, and even if it's not, we're not sending our whole army to Iraq. I think a better example would be the Battle of Potidaia. But of course, that's not easy to sell to the New York Times. It's not as glamorous. But what was the Battle of Potidaia? The Battle of Potidaia was one of the first battles of the Peloponnesian War, and it did cost Athens a lot of people. It also cost Athens a lot of resources. And Athens had to spend several years in Potidaia before she was able to establish a democracy there. And the democracy that she established there was always unstable. So if you want to compare, if you want to use Thucydides to talk about contemporary politics, we should write articles in the New York Times about the Battle of Potidaia. So at that point, I got interrupted by the moderator. Which never happens in academic forums. And the moderator slammed the table. And he basically said, he basically said without saying it, no one on this panel has said what I wanted to say. Right? He said, no one on this panel has said anything. Now this is very irregular, by the way, for a moderator to interrupt and start taking a side against the panelists. I mean, the whole point of moderator... That's not the role of moderator. He says, I have a book here which argues definitively that the United States is an empire, and we have 633 bases around the world, and no one here on this panel has tried to refute this book. And then I thought to myself, but didn't say it. I should have said it, but it would have made things worse. You didn't ask us to talk about that book. You asked us to talk about Thucydides, and we've all talked about Thucydides. But I didn't say that. If I had tenure, I would have said that. So I bit my tongue. And then the rules of the PLS seminars are supposed to be that the students ask questions, and then the professors can ask questions. So what happened after the moderator's outburst, a professor stood up and pointed her fingers at me. And basically started saying, how dare you suggest that we are not an empire and that we are not expanding overtly and militarily. And I thought I heard a cackle at that point after the whole thing, but I can't confirm that. It's been so long since the event. But I figured this professor was a Marxist or a deconstructionist or a postmodernist. So I said, well, as far as I understand how empires grew and expanded, the best example we have of that in the 20th century is the Soviet Union, when it was communist. And so I gave this answer about So she was very quiet at that point. But then she sat down. And then another professor stood up. And I was asked questions by 3 different professors. And I don't remember all the questions until finally a student asked a question in which the student said, what gives us the right to be in Iraq right now? This was 2004. So we had been there now for a year or two. So I said to the student, I think it would be good if we distinguished your question. that there's really two questions here. One is, what gives us the right to go there in the first place? And the second question is, what gives us the right to stay there now that we're there? And at that point, I didn't even get to answer it. At that point, this other PLS professor stood up, and he just stood up, and he goes, "What's the matter with you? Just answer the question. He asked a question. Just answer his question." So at that point, the one PLS professor on the panel interrupted, and he basically tried to diffuse the whole situation. And so an hour and a half later, when the whole thing was over, actually what was good is that there was one student in the audience, and she's very smart, and she's very savvy. She kind of started taking the side of all the panelists against the professors. So she made the situation more complex for the professors. Because the idea at these things is that the students are all supposed to, in the end, agree with what all the professors think. And so we had just trashed that idea, right? Us panelists, we had just broken that idea. And so they had to do what they could to disrupt it. Because they thought that the female professor and that we were going to just come out and be completely critical of Bush and of the whole Iraqi war. And it's not even that we supported the Iraqi war. We gave nuanced ways of looking at it, and that wasn't good enough. So at the end of it, it was funny because there was cookies and milk and everything. And what ended up happening is that the female professor and I, we were left alone during cookies and milk. And then the one student who kind of tried to, pardon?
That's like a bad kindergarten story.
And I know, it's pretty fun. I don't know, I was kind of having fun even at the time. That was one of those times where I wasn't even worrying about it. I mean, it's not like getting called into the chairman's office or something like that. Right? I mean, it's... The principal's office, I'm sorry. You're right. So at the very beginning, as everyone's leaving, the female professor says to me, "Well, it looks like we're never being invited back." Because she's wise. She's very wise, and she's been around a long time, so she knows how these things work. And so she kind of laughed as she told me that, to kind of let me know she's gone through this before herself.
Does she have tenure?
Oh yeah. No, she was stolen to come to this university.
She's still here?
Yeah.
What's her name?
Yeah. I'll tell you off camera. When it's not being recorded.
Jesus is gonna hand you down.
Because you never know what Jesus could do to me now that he has tenure.
He's tenure.
Oh yeah, he got tenure 2 years ago.
Wait.
Wait, so he's a professor? And he's taking this class?
Yes.
Huh. Does he actually exist?
If you take it next semester, you'll see him.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, no, next fall.
The second coming of Jesus.
Next fall. So Socrates suggests to Gorgias that persuasion or oratory should be connected to what is just or unjust at 454b. Right? That somehow we should connect it to what is good and evil, just and unjust. But Gorgias resists this claim. For Gorgias, oratory is simply convincing the crowd. It's being convinced. So in as much as someone speaks about justice or injustice, it's a mask. And of course, Nietzsche became the philosopher of masks. He said at any given moment, all we're doing is wearing masks, which cover our true instincts. And for Gorgias, the ultimate science is the science of the orator. He says why? It's orators and politicians, not craftsmen, who really decided to build the walls of Athens, for example. So his idea is that the politicians are the ones who create the construct of society. They create the constructs by which everybody else thinks. In some ways, you could say that's how Wilhelm Reich thought. That we're not interested in the truth of things. We're interested in changing behavior, because in changing behavior, we can change the constructs by which people think. Socrates, in refuting Gorgias, pushes the argument. He uses the example of the doctor. The doctor is someone who persuades, but he also persuades in a way that is related to the health of the patient, to what is good or bad for the body. The implication here is that the orator is like the doctor of the city. That the orator, when he persuades according to what is good or bad for the health of the city. What enables the city and the groups within it to flourish. What's implied by Socrates' argument, what's implied by the argument of Socrates is that even to wear a mask by which you hide, by which an orator might hide what is good or what is evil, the orator, even in hiding what is just or unjust or good or evil, is showing by his very capacity to hide that he knows what justice and injustice are. So I'll repeat that. Even if the orator is hiding what is just or unjust, the very fact he is hiding reveals that he acknowledges there is a just and an unjust. I know if this is an example, it's a very graphic and contemporary example, and you might see it in your own lives. I've seen it in my life many times. But I know of a family where the mother started to cohabitate with someone, and she tried to hide it from the children. Well, the very fact she tried to hide it from the children is a sign that she knew it was wrong. Because if she really didn't think it was wrong, she wouldn't try to hide it from the children. Right? The mother of a divorced family, parents are divorced. I mean, likewise, you could say, if a father commits adultery, if he really thinks it's right, if he really thinks it's good to commit adultery, he wouldn't hide it from his wife and kids. He would just say, "Oh, I'm going out to see the mistress tonight, honey." I mean, I hate to laugh like that, because it's a tragedy when something like that happens. The other thing I learned about these situations is that a lot of times when people are trying to hide things from you, you can still discover the truth of what they're doing, even though they're hiding the truth from you. Because oftentimes when people are doing something that is unjust, they will tell different stories to different people. And usually, if you are trying to discover the truth about someone, and you know 3 or 4 people that person knows, you can tell just by the different stories you're hearing, you can start to assemble what the truth is. So, for example, in my own family, let's say I'm concerned about a brother or sister, right? Well, if I just ask my grandma how my brother or sister is doing, she'll tell me one thing. And then my dad will tell me something else. And my brother will tell me a third thing. And then I'll ask my brother or sister how they're doing, right? And usually, if my brother or sister is doing something wrong, they won't want me to know about it because I'm the fire breather. right? So they won't tell me the full truth, but they'll tell me enough so that I can put together the evidence I find out from everybody else, right? Because if my brother or sister is doing something wrong, they'll tell my grandma one thing, they'll tell my dad something else, and they'll tell my other brother or sister a third thing. So there's always a way to kind of get at the truth. The same thing works with the media. Different in the government will tell different people in the media different things. So there's a way by which you can use conjecture based on the different things you hear from different sources, what might be the truth of the situation. It's always a hypothesis, it's always conjecture. But, for example, my new hypothesis about the outrage in the Islamic world to the Pope's comments, what I'm going to say is very sensitive and could be mistaken in the wrong way. But the Pope said what he said. Then we hear in the newspapers that previously unknown Islamic organizations were spreading his message throughout the Middle East. And they were riling up the crowds. Now, I have a friend in Israel who told me many years ago that whenever you hear that a previously unheard of Islamic organization is acting in a Muslim country, it's usually the Mossad. Because the Mossad will usually get people going and rile up the crowds to make the Muslims look bad, to justify something that Israel is going to do next. Right? This way of acting in governments is an old technique. It's not new. The English used it to oppress the Catholics during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. The whole famous gunpowder plot. How did that happen? English agents went into a bar, like this bar here. They found a drunk guy who was Catholic named Guy Fawkes. Fawkes. They got him to basically start talking about how he was going to assassinate the Queen. Then all these news sources discovered this, and they revealed this fact to the secret police of England at the time. And this became a huge scandal in England, which was then used to make more repressive laws against the Catholics, to ban Mass. Catholics couldn't have Mass on Sundays. They couldn't have any public sacraments, no marriages, no funerals. Priests were not allowed to live celibate lives anymore. All the nuns had to marry. It's true.
How did you force that?
Oh, it's true.
Somebody to marry. Weird.
You basically say, if you don't marry, I will kill you.
I didn't force an action.
Well, that would really motivate me.
That's how the French revolutionaries learned all these tactics and used them during the 1790s, during the French Revolution.
Thank you.
That's how the goal of the French Revolution was to reduce the number of priests and religious in France from 130,000 to 6,000. And one thing they did is they first confiscated all the monasteries. Then they made it illegal to live a religious vow. And they basically said, if you live celibacy, we will kill you. The penalty the penalty during the French Revolution for making a religious vow was death.
What if you just couldn't find a wife, though?
They would get you one. Or they would exile you. Yes. Okay, so my friend said, this was in the 90s. My friend said he was an Israeli citizen, and he said it's common knowledge in Israel. He was here studying as a graduate student. It's common knowledge in Israel, whenever you read in the newspaper that a previously unheard of Islamic organization has instigated some action, it's usually the Mossad. And it's the Mossad basically trying to make the Muslims look so radical that it justifies an Israeli action against them. So I found an article over the weekend, which this could be verified. It wouldn't be that hard to verify it. but that in many Islamic countries, Israel is supporting or secretly supporting or hoping that radical Muslims come to power. For example, in Lebanon and in Syria. Why? This would justify Israeli actions against these countries. There's a way by which Israel benefits from the Hamas coming to power in Palestine. It justifies Israeli incursions into Palestinian territories. We know this is common knowledge. There was an Israeli official making rounds at conservative American think tanks last November and December describing what an Israeli invasion of Palestine and Lebanon would look like. And they were looking for a pretext to do this. So what I say is interesting about this is that last Monday the Vatican, for the first time ever, on its website, put all of the Pope's statements in Arabic using the Vatican translation. Why? Because the Vatican learned that some group was mistranslating its statements and spreading them throughout the Islamic world. Well, I don't know exactly the whole story, but this weekend I found a quote from someone. It's either I forget if it was AIPAC, like an Israel, someone in the United States, or someone in Israel, basically saying that the reaction in the Middle East to the Pope was the Pope getting what was coming to him for his statement at Auschwitz earlier this year. In other words, at Auschwitz earlier this year, the Pope, when he spoke about the German Holocaust or the Jewish Holocaust, he said that the Holocaust was the fruit of a neo-pagan ideology. Basically, he implied that the Holocaust was the fruit of Nietzschean philosophy lived out in society. That would upset people in the West because people in the West are pro-Nietzsche. It upset the Israelis because there's many Israelis that try to argue, also in our own country, that Abe Foxman, who is one of the spokesmen for the Jewish Defense League in the United States, every time he mentions Germany, he says the Holocaust was the fruit of a Catholic ideology that's been going on in Europe for the last 2,000 years. That's almost a quote. And he basically says the Holocaust was another example of Catholic fascism. If you actually look at the voting records in Germany, who voted for the Communist Party and who voted for the Fascist Party, almost to a county, the Catholic counties voted against the Communists and against the Fascists. Almost to a county, the same county that supported the Communists in the 20s supported the Fascists in the 30s. Why? Because the Fascists were an outgrowth of the Communist Party. The first title of the Fascist Party was the National Socialist Party. And they were the Socialist Party because they disagreed with this idea that we should commit ourselves to international socialism. And they argued that instead, we should commit ourselves to national socialism. So the implication here is that the Pope, what everyone was hoping was that when the Pope went to Auschwitz last May or June, whenever it was, that he would apologize for how the Catholic Church led to the Holocaust. But he didn't do that, and so now everybody's mad at him. And so this guy was quoted, this Israeli was quoted as saying this past weekend that this outburst in the Middle East was the Pope getting what was due to him for not mentioning this at Auschwitz.
So basically, the Israelis stirred this up. Like, is that kind of what you're saying? He's implying? Is the Messiah?
My hypothesis would be, it's a hypothesis. It's only a hypothesis. I'm willing. The evidence that we would have to get to prove it wrong, I think it exists, but we might not be able to get it right now. because there's probably memos that are secret. Not secret, but there's memos that are classified that we couldn't read. But I have a twofold hypothesis. Number one is that we in the United States are being prepared for a war or some sort of bombing of Iran and or Syria. In order to do that and to justify it, the one voice that will speak against this is the Pope. And there are, Catholics are whatever percentage of the population in the United States. So part of this bigger struggle to get us ready for the bombing in Syria and Iran, or Iran and Syria, part of this bigger struggle is getting the whole American population to think, number one, that Muslims are less than human, and number two, that we shouldn't listen to the Vatican when it speaks out against the bombing. And I think going back to January, there's clear signs of some sort of a propaganda effort to get us ready for something going on in the Middle East, in which there's going to be unjust actions against Muslims. I'm not defending Islam or radical terrorist Islam either, but there's going to be some sort of unjust action taken against radical Islam if we were to use just war criteria to evaluate it. And the way we can overcome people criticizing this action as unjust is by getting them to think that Muslims are less than human and not listening to those few organs that are left in the world that articulate just war theory. Is that yours or mine? That's mine, okay.
Does what the Pope say about this really matter that much? Because he speaks out about everything. The Pope speaks out about.
On the one hand, it doesn't. On the one hand, it doesn't matter. On the other hand, just war theory is a theory that's based in reason, and it's something that Cicero upheld. It's something that Plato and Socrates upheld, and Aristotle. So it's something that's upheld on the principles of reason, not just on the principles of faith. So it's not a religious statement, necessarily. What's true, though, what happens to be the case, as with many other things that are provable using reason, as sometimes seemed the case, is that the church is the only institution left in the world, oftentimes, that defends reason on these matters. Seemingly.
You qualified that like 3 times.
So, well, it doesn't... I want to make clear the point that it's not the just war theory is not a religious theory.
Has there ever been a just war?
Yes. The First Crusades. The First Crusades was a just war.
Would
Why?
the Allies in World War II?
Well, let's stick with the Crusades first. That's an easier case. The First Crusades, there were many cities that as late as the time of the First Crusades were majority Christian in those days, cities were basically autonomous. There were many cities that as late as the First Crusades, despite 5 centuries of Islamic warfare against them, still maintained a majority Christian population. One of them being Ephesus. Ephesus in 1180 was taken over by the Muslims militarily, along with a number of other cities going all the way down to Jerusalem. Many of these cities still had majority Christian populations. So these 4 Christian princes got together and they said, we need to liberate the Christian populations from their Islamic oppressors. And that the First Crusades set out to free the cities, which were Christian cities, between Ephesus and Jerusalem, and then to set up a kingdom to defend them. So it's a just war. And they could have, there's a number of cities that they probably, from a military standpoint, if they would have attacked them, they might have established a permanent Christian state in the Middle East. But because they followed just war theory, they didn't attack these cities. And that led this Christian state to only last for 100 years. It was eventually defeated And probably most of the Crusades after the First Crusades were unjust. Or at least I don't know them well enough to argue about them. I would also say the Reconquista of Spain was a just war. Because again, you have Spain was a 70 to 80% Catholic country. It was betrayed by a minority population that lived within it, and then it was taken over by the Muslims. And then it was ruled for 4 centuries it was ruled in a brutal way for 4 centuries by a minority Islamic population. And what is the Reconquista? It's basically the attempt by the Spaniards to overthrow the minorities who had been oppressing them for 4 centuries. So I know it's not the best example. I mean, in our current cultural milieu, it's very insensitive to use those as the examples. But I think that they're clear cases of just wars.
Anything in like America's history?
Actually, I think you could argue that Vietnam was a just war. At least in causa. At least for the cause of going to war. Because why? You have a population you have a country that is stably ruled. There might be injustices in it, but it's a stable political regime. That country is trying to be subverted by violent revolutionaries who are communists and who are willing to use any brutal tactic to undo the regime and to install a worse regime than the one that currently exists. So the efforts originally to go to Vietnam were to keep the current regime there in place and to prevent violent revolution and to prevent a much more violent regime from taking its place. So by just war theory, you're going to war for a defensive war. You're using means that are proportionate to those that are being used against you, and you're not seeking to expand. So at least for going to war, Vietnam is a just war.
What about the European theater of World War II?
Well, I would always distinguish between jus in causa, just war for going to war, and jus in bello, how you carry out the war. And I think that World War II, we were just in going to war. I think there was a point in time where we stopped abiding by just war theory in the way we carried out the war.
Even in Europe.
In Europe and in Japan.
Like the Dresden bombings and like
Example.
bombing civilians
Yes.
all the time.
Yeah, because we started bombing civilians. Au revoir.
Good luck.
The American Revolutionary War? I don't think it was. I think on just war criteria, it was not a just war. Because why? The injustices that we were claiming were so serious were not serious enough reasons for going to war. That probably over time we would have obtained the independence we fought for anyway. So, I mean, I think according to just war theory, the Revolutionary War would not be a just war. Because over time, we would have obtained the independence we were fighting for anyway. So the Revolutionary War would be what's called an act of precipitation. We would have manipulated events to such an extent that we forced a conflict that didn't need to exist. Now, I know all these statements are highly controversial.
Can't you say then that you said that we went for war, like the Revolutionary War, like it would have happened eventually, or like
The separation from England and our own independence would have happened eventually, yes.
Can't you say that, like in Vietnam, for instance, it would have happened eventually, like and the regime that they were trying to form would have deteriorated anyway?
Well, I would argue this, that it wouldn't have. The only reason it would deteriorate into communism was because of the revolutionaries. I think if you would have let Vietnam exist, usually what happens when tyrants rule, or when dictators rule, usually over time, a more democratic and republican form of rule will take its place. In Vietnam, the choice was not letting, let's say, the autocrat become a democracy. Instead, it was the autocrat becoming a revolutionary communist society. So that's how I would make that distinction. For example, in most Latin American countries, only now, and we'll see what happens, in most Latin American countries, they've been in a cycle for the last 200 years of going from autocrat or dictator to democracy to coup to oligarchs to autocrat, democracy, dictator. Like Chavez right now, Venezuela is the classic example of what happens in Latin American countries. There's an autocrat ruling. The autocrat gives up power. It becomes somewhat democratic. And then a demagogue takes power, and he becomes a dictator. Out of that dictatorship, a new oligarchy will form. And then the oligarchy will give way to an autocrat, to a democracy, to an autocrat, and then to another dictator. There's a kind of violent cycle in Latin America over the last 200 years. It seems like in some Latin American societies right now, like in Chile and in Mexico and maybe in Argentina, from this kind of time of autocracy, Pinochet, the oligarchs who ruled in Argentina in the 80s, and then the revolutionaries that ruled in Mexico up until the 1990s, we see emerging out of these societies democracies. And they emerge stable, almost without any revolution. Hopefully they will become stable. We shall see. But that's what should happen in a society. What was going to happen in Vietnam was a violent communist revolution, so it's a different example. Whereas what was probably going to happen in the U.S. would be much like England and Australia. Over time, we would petition for more and more independence from England, to the point where we became independent.
Exactly, but I mean that's definitely. You said it was independence, but that's like a big claim to make that Vietnam wouldn't have had that later down the road. I mean,
That it wouldn't have.
Assume that they wouldn't have tried to get more democracy.
Well, I think we know for sure they were being threatened by the communists.
Exactly, but I mean you don't know what's going to happen. Not just from
No, it's true. It's true. We don't know what's going to happen from the autocracy. Right?
But I mean, even though.
But an autocracy is better than a violent revolution.
But won't a violent revolution end up the cycle? I mean, even in the Republic, where Plato talks about.
Oh, that's true.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
So you just caught it at the bad stage of the center.
Right.
So if that happens, later, it wouldn't really be considered just war in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, that could be an argument, right? Yeah, I'll concede that's a respectable argument.
Okay.
Now, Paulus. Paulus replaces Gorgias. The will replaces the logo, the supposed logos, the perilogos. The will replaces the perilogos, the almost logos. Paulus argues that oratory is basically the freedom of speech, and freedom of speech here is the capacity to give long speeches, to say whatever one wants, without having to be questioned by anybody else. Socrates responds that what?
I'm laughing, I'm still here.
Oh, John? Well, they have a meeting here at 9,
okay.
yeah.
I thought it just...
Socrates responds that oratory really is not a craft. It's not an art in the end. It's a knack. Someone who has experience knows how to please and gratify. It's like making donuts. I'm going to replace pastry making with donut makings. Dunkin' Donuts, the Dunkin' Donuts man. Oratory is like being the Dunkin' Donuts man. Time to make the donuts. It's like cooking. It's like a knack. The cook that I have at my house She has no recipes. But she just knows how to make things. She has the knack for it. She just says, well, you put a little bit of this in and a little bit of that in, and then if you really love it and you cook it right, it comes out okay. Right? That's the knack. She has the knack. And Socrates says that's what oratory is. Pardon?
The shining.
Right. It's a knack. It's like making donuts. And just because, by the way, just because it's a knack doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that to be truly admirable, it needs to be connected to something else. So oratory, it's getting experience so that your hunches as how to please the crowd are right. Or so that you can be clever and bold in dealing with people. And so therefore Socrates says it's like flattery. It's like cosmetics, flattery, and sophistry. There are 4 knacks that are related to each other. Donut making, oratory, makeup, and sophistry. These are all the 4 parts of flattery. This is one of those times where Socrates is saying something that's funny and true at the same time. Right? I mean, imagine putting donut making, makeup, or cosmetics, sophistry, and oratory all together. The true sciences of politics are not sophistry and oratory. The true sciences of politics are legislation and justice. And sophistry, or cosmetics and donut making are to legislation and justice. Sorry. Cosmetics, it's very hard to get these analogies right. Cosmetics and donut making are to the body and health what sophistry and oratory are to legislation and justice. So I'll say that again. Cosmetics and donut making are to the body and health what oratory and sophistry are to legislation and justice. So, donut making is very pleasing to children, but it might not be good for them in the end. So likewise, oratory and sophistry, they might be very pleasing to the children that make up the political community, but in the end, they might not be good for it. Why? Because donut making does not account for what is good for the body. Likewise, sophistry and oratory, they fail to account for what is good for the person or what is good for the political community in the nature of things. Callicles will later on in the dialogue argue that Socrates fails to account for nature or instinct. But Socrates' counter-argument is going to be that Callicles himself cannot give a full account of the nature of things. That law and reason are part of the nature of things. Or reason and law are part of the nature of things. And therefore, since Callicles cannot truly use reason, he's not truly accounting for the nature of things. And this is one of the problems of sophistry. It fails to account fully for the nature of things. This is what the Pope was saying at Regensburg 2 weeks ago, that the modern West fails. The modern West, because it's so attached to science and technology and then postmodernism or instinct. In other words, the modern West is so attached to Hippias, Protagoras, and Callicles that it fails to account for the nature of things. It fails to account for logos and wisdom. So really in the West, it's not that we need to get religious and have a religious revival, though that might help. What we really need is to return to Socrates. Or a nice first step, if you're afraid of the Pope, would be to be a return to Socrates. At 465D, there's an allusion to Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras argues, one of his arguments, by the way, and Anaxagoras was the teacher of Pericles. There's some good things and some bad things ultimately about Anaxagoras. One of the bad things, which is what Socrates refers to here, is Anaxagoras was one of those who argued that all things are together and there is no difference between things. Everything is the same. What this means is that a bad intentioned sophist like Callicles could reduce this to say that everything is caused by instinct. Everything is caused by instinct. So there's no justice or injustice. There's no difference between men and animals. Everything is instinct. And Anaxagoras thought that we were glorified animals. Actually, I have a funny story from a philosophy of human nature class that a friend of mine is in. A former student of mine is in a philosophy of human nature class right now. And he was telling me that a couple weeks ago they were talking about whether humans have a soul. And the professor opened things up to discussion. Do you know this?
No, it's a funny question.
Whether human and then there's a lot of seniors in this class who are anthropology majors, and they started arguing, following Anaxagoras and Nietzsche, that we're all just instincts, and so because we're all just instincts, we're no different from animals. And all the anthropology majors were taking over the class until finally this football player, who seemingly wasn't paying any attention and had missed a third of the classes already, he kind of half woke up at one point. He said, "Professor, hang on a second. I am not my mother's dog. I am a spiritual being. God created me, and he gave me a soul. I am not my mother's dog. You can't tell me that I'm an animal." So at this point, the anthropologists lost their control of the class. And then there was he had another intervention on the same day. Oh yeah, the anthropologists tried to take over the class by arguing that everything is just instinct and we're all just secretions of hormones. So that the reason that we cry when our mother dies is that we're so used to seeing her that when we stop seeing her, we stop secreting this hormone, and then we start to cry. This is what she learned in her anthropology class. Have you heard this before? Pardon? You've already heard this?
No, it's the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
Okay, good. So this football player agrees with you. And he says, "Hang on a second, Professor. I'm not a bunch of hormones. When I stop seeing a lot of people in this class, even if I were to see them every day for the rest of my life, I wouldn't cry." But when my mother dies, and I'm at her grave, and she's 6 feet under the earth, I'm going to cry. So the football player won the day on that one. There was a last-minute comeback. In this second argument of Polus, which begins at 466, Socrates, this is where he refutes Polus with the argument, even if you do what's unjust, even if you kill people, take property, and banish the just people, you at least in your own mind have to have a sense of justice. you at least have to defend this as being just to somebody, whether it's yourself or the crowd. You at least have to give an account for justice when you're doing unjust things. That's a sign that there is such a thing as justice, because you always have to account for it. In other words, you always have within you, even if you don't admit it, you always have deep within your heart an account of what is just or unjust. What? That's the whole point of all the arguments with Paulus. By the way, he also noticed there's a common argument today. You'll hear this in the dorms a lot, where Paulus makes this argument against Socrates. He says, "Oh, Socrates, what about Archelaus? That guy killed a lot of people. He banished a lot of people. He took away everybody's property, and he has rule in his city. So there's no justice." A lot of people these days that follow Ayn Rand, that's the argument they'll make. They'll make that, well, there's a lot of people out there that they just pursue money for its own sake. And they just pursue their self-interest. They get power for themselves. They live happy marriages. They have a wife and a mistress, and there's no problem. Right? So what's wrong with that? There's no justice. We all just live after self-interest. That's what the followers of Ayn Rand was, a 20th century follower of Nietzsche. And she wrote The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. All these books trying to... And actually, it's interesting. It's interesting that Ayn Rand also, she only told stories. Right? She didn't write a treatise. And the sophists would only tell stories. Paulus tries to tell stories. Protagoras tries to tell stories. They don't want to use argument to defend their assertion. Paulus, when he's here in his argument, when he tries to defend his position against Socrates, he doesn't use argument. He just asserts a counterexample. He doesn't make an argument. He says, this is what Archelaus does, so there. And Socrates points out, this is not an argument. This is just an example. Now, I also know from research that I've done that Ayn Rand herself was not capable of accepting her own philosophy lived out. Did I tell you guys this? When she was about 50 years old, this 40-year-old guy left his wife, divorced his wife, to basically marry Ayn Rand. And he changed his name to Nathan Bernard. Or no, Nathan Bertrand. Bernard. No, wait. It's so I know what I need to write it out here. Hang on. It's Oh yeah, he changed his name to Nathan. He changed his name to Nathan. I think it's Nathan Bertrand. Bertrand means, if you take apart, means son of Rand. Like, he was such an admirer of Ayn Rand that he changed his name to Bertrand, son of, like, R-A-N-D is in the word, and B-E-N is in the word. Nathan Bernard. Is that right? I forget the name exactly. But anyway, he purposely took the name B-E-N, which means son of, and R-A-N-D, Rand, and he made that his name to show what a follower he was of Ayn Rand, as he divorced his wife and went to live with Ayn Rand. 10 years later, he divorced Ayn Rand to marry a 20-year-old blonde. And she wrote him all these letters saying, how could you do this to me? How could you leave me like that? Don't you know that I'm a god? And he basically wrote her back and said, look, I'm just living your philosophy. I'm just following what my self-interest is right now. Can't you accept that? And she would write him back basically saying, no, I can't. You have to come back to me. You can't abandon me like this in my old age. So Ayn Rand herself was incapable of accepting her own philosophy of life as it was lived to her, as it was applied to her. I also know some more tragic stories of people who adopted her philosophy and lived it, and then ended up, like I know of a story of a lady who used Ayn Rand's philosophy to justify becoming a mistress. And she was a mistress of a very prominent man for 30 years. And then eventually she cracked. She said to the guy, either divorce your wife and marry me, or I'm going to go nuts. The guy refused to divorce his wife, and so she committed suicide. Right, so this philosophy is a destructive philosophy, would be one of my arguments. Socrates points out that in the end, this is where he starts to make the argument that in the end, the worst thing that could happen to you in life would be to commit injustice and to not be punished for it. You might say very cheaply, there's 3 potential conditions in life. One is to commit injustice and not be punished. That's the worst of all conditions. Maybe there's 4 conditions in life. One is to commit injustice and not be punished. That is the worst condition of life. 2 is to commit injustice and be punished. That's actually pretty good, because then you're paying for the sufferings that you've committed, or the injustices that you've committed. When you're punished for injustices, your soul is being healed. Yeah, but it's also just But also, like, if you ever have to deal with an alcoholic, the best thing you can do for an alcoholic is let them face whatever penalties of law they are exposed to. So if an alcoholic gets a driving under the influence, the best thing you can do for them is to let them figure out how to post bail when they go to jail. The best thing you can do for them is to, when they get a lawyer, let them pay for it. And I mean this if it's your husband, if it's your wife, if it's your child. The best thing you can do for them is to let them suffer the consequences of their actions. For many alcoholics, that is the only thing that will lead them to escape from their alcoholism. Actually, the best thing you can do for them is to get an intervention going. That's actually the best thing you can do, because that's a kind of punishment by which you get them to go away for 6 months or something like that. It's a punishment. And it costs everybody a lot to punish them in that way. But that's a much better punishment than a death in the family or a DUI or any other kind of punishment by law that they will get eventually. Or deathbed experiences because they go crazy or commit suicide or die. Right? The best thing you can do for an alcoholic, and I see it so many times where an alcoholic gets some sort of a DUI and someone in the family bribes the judge to lessen the penalty, or they pay for the lawyer. And all this does is this enables the alcoholic to not face their situation. It's very hard. It's very hard to both at the same time, when you're dealing with an alcoholic, to be compassionate and understanding without giving in. But that is actually the best thing that enables them to escape from their alcoholism. It's counterintuitive, but that's actually the truth. So if you ever have to deal with an alcoholic and they get a penalty, let them pay their own lawyer, let them post their own bail, let them discover on their own how they're going to get out of things. Because by not doing that, you're prolonging their illness. And I think that's what Socrates kind of means here, applied to a real life situation. The third best position, the second best position, is to always do what is just, even if you suffer. Right? So even if you suffer punishment unjustly, you still do not commit an injustice. And obviously the best condition in life is to do what is just and to not be punished, or to not suffer. But it seems like for most of us,
Would you say that to do justice, to do what's just, and be punished is better?
no. I mean, ultimately, I think you could argue that if you are just and you receive suffering, let's leave. There's a difference between punishment and suffering. To be just and to suffer, that could purify you, and that could prepare you for a better good. But obviously, from the human standpoint, the best thing is to be just and not to suffer. Even though in the end it could be, you might be right, in other words. It could be in the end that that suffering purifies us and prepares us for a good that we could never obtain if we didn't suffer.
I mean, the thing that I thought was just that if there's no barrier to doing just things, then I mean, you know what I mean? If you're not getting punished for it, why not? Why do something unjust? You know what I mean? Whereas if you're being punished for continuing to be just, then it's even more like.
Well, there's still a risk. There's a risk in that.
Right, but I think ultimately Augustine will argue that there's a difference between punishment and suffering, and that suffering prepares us for a good that we could never obtain if we hadn't suffered. That there is a punishment, or suffering is not just punishment, in other words. Suffering could be to correct our faults. It could be to prevent us from future faults. There are 3 or 4 potential features of suffering. 1 is to correct our past faults. 2 could be to prevent us from future faults. 3 could be to correct defects or vices that are within us. 4 is that it could be a preparation for a good that God wants to give us. That's the suffering of the cross. That's the suffering. Actually, the cross encompasses all of those. Correction of faults of others, but also for Christ and for us, preparation of a greater good. The last point I want to make is we'll finish off Callicles next week, but I just want to set up the problem of Callicles. Callicles argues the pre-Socratic position that ultimately nomos and physis are at odds with each other. Nomos is N-O-M-O-S, and physis is P-H-Y-S-I-S. P-H-Y-S-I-S. And nomos, N-O-M-O-S. Ultimately, nomos and physis are at odds with each other, and law is irrational. Law is just made up. It's just custom, made up over time. It's instinct over time. That's the postmodern argument nowadays. Law is just something that's made up. It's a cultural construct. Might be the language that people use these days. What Callicles wants to argue is that ultimately instinct rules, or nature is what rules. But nature is just instinct. Nature is just my passions. Socrates will argue ultimately that nomos, or law, is more than what Callicles says it is, and nature also is more than what Callicles says it is. Nature is ultimately logos moderating passions or instinct, and law also is ultimately logos judging law. And to know what logos is, we have to know what divine wisdom is. This is the argument. This is the basic. So the basic problem of Callicles is everything law or is everything law or is everything nature? Socrates will argue that Callicles has a limited understanding of law and nature. With that, we will end.